Book the 2nd, Chapter the 9th, of the happy life Oliver began to lead with his kind friends. Oliver's ailings were neither slight nor few. In addition to the pain and delay attendant upon a broken limb, his exposure to the wet and cold had brought on fever and ague, which hung about him for many weeks, and reduced him sadly. But at length he began by slow degrees to get better, and to be able to say sometimes, in a few tearful words, how deeply he felt the goodness of the two sweet ladies, and how ardently he hoped that when he grew strong and well again, he could do something to show his gratitude. Only something which would let them see the love and duty with which his breast was full, something, however slight, which would prove to them that their general kindness had not been cast away, but that the poor boy whom their charity had rescued from misery or death was eager and anxious to serve them with all his heart and soul. "Poor fellow," said Rose, when Oliver had been one day feebly endeavoring to utter the words of thankfulness that rose to his pale lips. "You shall have many opportunities of serving us, if you will. We are going into the country, and my aunt intends that you shall accompany us. The quiet place, the pure air, and all the pleasures and beauties of spring will restore you in a few days, and we will employ you in 100 ways when you can bear the trouble." "The trouble!" cried Oliver. "Oh, dear lady, if I could but work for you, if I could only give you pleasure by watering your flowers, or watching your birds, or running up and down the whole day long to make you happy, what would I give to do it?" "You shall give nothing at all," said Miss Maylay, smiling, "for, as I told you before, we shall employ you in 100 ways, and if you only take half the trouble to please us that you promise now, you will make me very happy indeed." "Happy, ma'am?" cried Oliver. "Oh, how kind of you to say so." "You will make me happier than I can tell you," replied the young lady. "To think that my dear good aunt should have been the means of rescuing any one from such sad misery as you've described to us, would be an unspeakable pleasure to me. But to know that the object of her goodness and compassion was sincerely grateful and attached in consequence would delight me more than you can well imagine. Do you understand me?" she inquired, watching Oliver's thoughtful face. "Oh, yes, ma'am, yes," replied Oliver eagerly. "But I was thinking that I am ungrateful now." "To whom?" inquired the young lady. "To the kind gentleman and the dear old nurse who took so much care of me before," rejoined Oliver. "If they knew how happy I am, they would be pleased." "I am sure they would," rejoined Oliver's benefactress. "And Mr. Losborne has already been kind enough to promise that when you are well enough to bear the journey, he will carry you to see them." "Has he, ma'am?" cried Oliver, his face brightening with pleasure. "I don't know what I shall do for joy when I see their kind faces once again." In a short time Oliver was sufficiently recovered to undergo the fatigue of this expedition. One morning he and Mr. Losborne set out accordingly in a little carriage which belonged to Mrs. Maylay. When they came to Chertsey, hard to say, Chertsey Bridge, Oliver turned very pale and uttered a loud exclamation. "What's the matter with the boy?" cried the doctor, as usual, all in a bustle. "Do you see anything, hear anything, feel anything? Eh?" "That, sir," cried Oliver, pointing out of the carriage window, "that house!" "Yes, well, what of it?" "Stop, coachman, pull up here," cried the doctor. "What of the house, my man? Eh?" "The thieves! The house they took me to," whispered Oliver. "The devil it is," cried the doctor. "Hello there! Let me out!" But before the coachman could dismount from his box, he had tumbled out of the coach by some means or other, and running down to the deserted tenement, began kicking at the door like a madman. "Hello," said a little, ugly, hump-backed man, opening the door so suddenly that the doctor, from the very impetus of his last kick, nearly fell forward into the passage. "What's the matter here?" "Matter!" exclaimed the other, collaring him without a moment's reflection. "A good deal. Robbery is the matter." "There'll be murder, too," replied the humpbacked man coolly, "if you don't take your hands off. Do you hear me?" "I hear you," said the doctor, giving his captive a hearty shake. "Where's— confound the fellow, what's his rascally name? Sykes, that's it. Where's Sykes, you thief?" The humpbacked man stared as if in excess of amazement and indignation, and twisting himself dexterously from the doctor's grasp, growled forth a volley of horrid oaths, and retired into the house. Before he could shut the door, however, the doctor had passed into the parlor without a word of parley. He looked anxiously round. Not an article of furniture, not a vestige of anything, animate or inanimate, not even the position of the cupboards, answered Oliver's description. "Now," said the hunchbacked man, who had watched him keenly, "what do you mean by coming into my house in this violent way? Do you want to rob me? Or to murder me? Which is it?" "Did you ever know a man come out to do either in a chariot and pair, you ridiculous old vampire?" said the irritable doctor. "What do you want, then?" demanded the hunchback fiercely. "Will you take yourself off before I do you a mischief? Curse you!" "As soon as I think proper," said Mr. Losberne, looking into the other parlor, which, like the first, bore no resemblance whatever to Oliver's account of it. "I shall find you out some day, my friend." "Will you?" sneered the ill-favored cripple. "If you ever want me, I'm here. I haven't lived here mad, and all alone, for 25 years to be scared by you. You shall pay for this. You shall pay for this." And so saying, the misshapen little demon set up a hideous yell, and danced upon the ground, as if frantic with rage. "Stupid enough, this," muttered the doctor to himself. "The boy must have made a mistake. There, put that in your pocket and shut yourself up again." With these words, he flung the hunchback a piece of money, and returned to the carriage. The man followed to the chariot door, uttering the wildest imprecations and curses all the way, but as Mr. Losberne turned to speak to the driver, he looked into the carriage, and eyed Oliver for an instant with a glance so sharp and fierce, and at the same time so furious and vindictive, that waking or sleeping he could not forget it for months afterwards. He continued to utter the most fearful imprecations until the driver had resumed his seat. When they were once more on their way, they could see him some distance behind, beating his feet upon the ground, and tearing his hair in transports of frenzied rage. "I am an ass," said the doctor after a long silence. "Did you know that before, Oliver?" "No, sir." "Then don't forget it another time." "An ass," said the doctor again, after a further silence of some minutes. "Even if it had been the right place, and the right fellows had been there, what could I have done single-handed? And if I had had assistance, I see no good that I should have done except leading to my own exposure, and an unavoidable statement of the manner in which I have hushed up this business. That would have served me right, though. I'm always involving myself in some scrape or other by acting upon these impulses, and it might have done me good." Now the fact was that the excellent doctor had never acted upon anything else but impulse all through his life, and it was no bad compliment to the nature of the impulses which governed him, that so far from being involved in any peculiar troubles or misfortunes, he had the warmest respect and esteem of all who knew him. If the truth must be told, he was a little out of temper for a minute or two, and being disappointed in procuring corroborative evidence of Oliver's story on the very first occasion on which he had a chance of obtaining any. He soon came round again, however, and finding that Oliver's replies to his questions were still as straightforward and consistent, and still delivered with as much apparent sincerity and truth as they had ever been, he made up his mind to attach full credence to them from that time forth. As Oliver knew the name of the street in which Mr. Brownlow resided, they were enabled to drive straight thither. When the coach turned into it, thither, his heart beat so violently, thither, that he could scarcely draw his breath, thither. "Now, my boy, which house is it?" inquired Mr. Losberne. That, replied Oliver, pointing eagerly out of the window. "The White House." "Oh, make haste. Pray, make haste. I feel as if I should die. It makes me tremble so." Come, said the good doctor, patting him on the shoulder. "You'll see them directly, and they'll be overjoyed to find you safe and well." "Oh, I hope so," cried Oliver. "They were so good to me, so very, very good to me, sir." The coach rolled on. It stopped. No, that was the wrong house, the next door. It was on a few paces, and stopped again. Oliver looked up at the windows with tears of happy expectation coursing down his face. Alas, the White House was empty, and there was a bill in the window. "To let." "Knock at the next door," cried Mr. Losberne, taking Oliver's arm in his. "What has become of Mr. Brownlow? Who used to live in the adjoining house? Do you know?" The servant did not know, but would go and inquire. She presently returned, and said that Mr. Brownlow had sold off his goods, and gone to the West Indies 6 weeks. 6 weeks before. Oliver clasped his hands and sank feebly backwards. "Has his housekeeper gone too?" inquired Mr. Losberne after a moment's pause. "Yes, sir," replied the servant. "The old gentleman, the housekeeper, and a gentleman, a friend of Mr. Brownlow's, all went together." "Then turn towards home again," said Mr. Losberne to the driver, "and don't stop to bait the horses till you get out of this confounded London." "The bookstall keeper, sir?" said Oliver. "I know the way there. See him, pray, sir, see him." "My poor boy, this is disappointment enough for one day," said the doctor. "Quite enough for both of us. If we go to the bookstall keeper's, we shall certainly find that he is dead, or has set his house on fire, or run away. No, home again straight." And in obedience to the doctor's first impulse, home they went. This bitter disappointment caused Oliver much sorrow and grief even in the midst of his happiness, for he had pleased himself many times during his illness with thinking of all that Mr. Brownlow and Mrs. Bedwin would say to him, and what delight it would be to tell them how many long days and nights he had passed in reflecting upon what they had done for him and bewailing their cruel separation. The hope of eventually clearing himself with them, too, and explaining how he had been forced away, had buoyed him up and sustained him under many of his recent trials, and now the idea that they should have gone so far and carried with them the belief that he was an impostor and a robber, a belief which might remain uncontradicted to his dying day, was almost more than he could bear. The circumstance occasioned no alteration, however, in the behavior of his benefactors. After another fortnight, when the fine warm weather had fairly begun, and every tree and flower was putting forth its young leaves and rich blossoms, they made preparations for quitting the house at Chertsey for some months, sending the plate which had so excited Mr. Fagin's cupidity to the bankers, and leaving Giles and another servant in care of the house, they departed for a cottage some distance in the country, and took Oliver with them. As much as this is missing some details of the narrative, this looks like it's talking almost about American President Thomas Jefferson. Who can describe the pleasure and delight, the peace of mind and soft tranquility which the sickly boy felt in the balmy air and among the green hills and rich woods of an inland village? Who can tell how scenes of peace and quietude sink into the minds of pain-worn dwellers in close and noisy places, and carry their own freshness deep into their jaded hearts? Men who have lived in crowded, pent-up streets through whole lives of toil, and never wished for change. Men to whom custom has indeed been second nature, and who have come almost to love each brick and stone that formed the narrow boundaries of their daily walks. Even they, with a hand of death upon them, have been known to yearn, at last, for one short glimpse of nature's face, and carried far from the scenes of their old pains and pleasures, have seemed to pass at once into a new state of being, and crawling forth from day to some green sunny spot, have had such memories wakened up within them by the mere sight of sky and hill and plain and glistening water, that a foretaste of heaven itself had soothed their quick decline, and they have sunk into their tombs as peacefully as the sun, whose setting they watched from their lonely chamber window but a few hours before, faded from their dim and feeble sight. The memories which peaceful country scenes call up are not of this world, or of its thoughts or hopes. Their gentle influence may teach us to weave fresh garlands for the graves of those we loved, may purify our thoughts, and bear down before it old enmity and hatred. But beneath all this there lingers, in the least reflective mind, a vague and half-formed consciousness of having held such feelings long before, in some remote and distant time, which calls up solemn thoughts of distant times to come, and bends down pride and worldliness beneath it. It was a lovely spot to which they repaired, and Oliver, whose days had been spent among squalid crowds and in the midst of noise and brawling, seemed to enter upon a new existence there. The rose and honeysuckle clung to the cottage walls, the ivy crept round the trunks of the trees, and the garden flowers perfumed the air with delicious odors. Hard by was a little churchyard, not crowded with tall, unsightly gravestones, but full of humble mounds covered with fresh turf and moss, beneath which the old people of the village lay at rest. Oliver often wondered that here, and, thinking of the wretched grave in which his mother lay, would sometimes sit him down and sob unseen. But as he raised his eyes to the deep sky overhead, he would cease to think of her as lying in the ground, and weep for her sadly, but without pain. It was a happy time. The days were peaceful and serene, and the nights brought with them no fear or care, no languishing in a wretched prison, or associating with wretched men. Nothing but pleasant and happy thoughts. Every morning he went to a white-headed old gentleman who lived near the little church, who taught him to read better and to write, and spoke so kindly, and took such pains, that Oliver could never try enough to please him. Then he would walk with Mrs. Mayline Rose, and hear them talk of books, or perhaps sit near them in some shady place, and listen whilst the young lady read, which he could have done till it grew too dark to see the letters. Then he had his own lesson for the next day to prepare, and at this he would work hard in a little room which looked into the garden, till evening came slowly on, when the ladies would walk out again, and he with them, listening with such pleasure to all they said, so happy if they wanted a flower that he could climb to reach. or had forgotten anything he could run to fetch, that he could never be quick enough about it. When it became quite dark, and they returned home, the young lady would sit down to the piano and play some melancholy air, or sing in a low and gentle voice some old song which it pleased her aunt to hear. There would be no candles at such times as these, and Oliver would sit by one of the windows, listening to the sweet music, while tears of tranquil joy stole down his face. And when Sunday came, how differently the day was spent from any manner in which he had ever spent it yet, and how happily, too, like all the other days, in the most happy time. There was the little church in the morning, with the green leaves fluttering at the windows, the birds singing without, and the sweet-smelling air stealing in the low porch and filling the homely building with its fragrance. The poor people were so neat and clean, and knelt so reverently in prayer, that it seemed a pleasure, not a tedious duty, their assembling there together. And though the singing might be rude, it was real and sounded more musical, to Oliver's ears at least, than any he had ever heard in church before. Then there was the walks, as usual. Many calls at the clean houses of the laboring men, and at night Oliver read a chapter or two from the Bible which he had been studying all the week, and the performance of which duty he felt more proud and pleased than if he had been the clergyman himself. In the morning, Oliver would be afoot by 6 o'clock, roaming the fields and surveying the hedges far and wide, for nosegays of wild flowers with which he would return laden home, and which it took great care and consideration to arrange to the best advantage for the embellishment of the breakfast table. There was fresh groundsel, too, for Miss Maylight's birds, with which Oliver, who had been studying the subject under the able tuition of the village clerk, would decorate the cages in the most approved taste. When the birds were made all spruce and smart for the day, there was usually some little commission of charity to execute in the village, or failing that, there was always something to do in the garden, or about the plants, to which Oliver, who had studied this science also under the same master, who was a gardener by trade, applied himself with hearty good will till Miss Rose made her appearance, when there were 1,000 commendations to be bestowed upon all he had done, for which one of those light-hearted, beautiful smiles was an ample recompense. This is embarrassing. So 3 months glided away, 3 months which, in the life of the most blessed and favored of mortals, would have been unmixed happiness, but which in Oliver's troubled and clouded dawn were felicity indeed. Indeed, with the purest and most amiable generosity on one side, and the truest and warmest and most soul-felt gratitude on the other, it is no wonder that by the end of that short time, Oliver Twist had become completely domesticated with the old lady and her niece, and that the fervent attachment of his young and sensitive heart was repaid by their pride in and attachment to himself. Book the 2nd, Chapter the 10th. Spring flew swiftly by, and summer came. And if the village had been beautiful at first, it was now in the full glow and luxuriance of its richness. The great trees, which had looked shrunken and bare in the earlier months, had now burst into strong life and health, and stretching forth their green arms over the thirsty ground, converted open and naked spots into choice nooks, where was a deep and pleasant shade from which to look upon the wide prospect steeped in sunshine. Sunshine, which lay stretched out beyond. The earth had donned her mantle of brightest green and shed her richest perfumes abroad. It was the prime and vigor of the year, and all things were glad and flourishing. Still the same quiet life went on at the little college. Quote, cottage, and the same cheerful serenity prevailed among its inmates. Oliver had long since grown stout and healthy. But health or sickness made no difference in his warm feelings to those about him, though they do in the feelings of a great many people, and he was still the same gentle, attached, affectionate creature that he had been when pain and suffering had wasted his strength, and he was dependent for every slight attention and comfort on those who tended him. One beautiful night they had taken a longer walk than was customary with them, for the day had been unusually warm. There was a brilliant moon, and a light wind had sprung up, which was unusually refreshing. Rose had been in high spirits too, and they had walked on in merry conversation until they had far exceeded their ordinary bounds. Mrs. Maylie was fatigued, and they returned more slowly home. The young lady, merely throwing off her simple bonnet, sat down to the piano as usual. After running abstractedly over the keys for a few minutes, she fell into a low and very solemn air, and as she played it, they heard her sob, as if she were weeping. "Rose, my dear?" said the elderly lady. Rose made no reply, but played a little quicker, as though the sound had roused her from some painful thoughts. "Rose, my love," cried Mrs. Maylie, rising hastily and bending over her. "What is this? Your face is bathed in tears. My dear child, what distresses you?" Nothing, replied the young lady. "I don't know what it is. I can't describe it, but I feel so low tonight, and—" "Not ill, my love?" interposed Mrs. Maylie. No, not ill," replied Rose, shuddering as though some deadly chillness were passing over her while she spoke. "At least, I shall be better presently. Close the window, pray." Oliver hastened to comply with the request, and the young lady, making an effort to recover her cheerfulness, strove to play livelier tune, but her fingers dropped powerless on the keys. Covering her face with her hands, she sank upon a sofa, quote, which was unnaturally refreshing, and gave vent to the tears which she now unable to repress. "My child," said the elderly lady, folding her arms about her, "I never saw you thus before. I would not alarm you if I could avoid it. This is embarrassing." "I would not alarm you if I could avoid it," rejoined Rose, "but indeed I've tried very hard and cannot help this. I fear I am ill, aunt." She was indeed, for when candles were brought, they saw that in the very short time which had elapsed since their return home, the hue of her countenance had changed to a marble whiteness. Its expression had lost nothing of its beauty, but yet it was changed, and there was an anxious, haggard look about that gentle face which it had never worn before. Another moment, and it was suffused with a crimson flush, and a heavy wildness came over the soft blue eye. Again this disappeared, like the shadow thrown by a passing cloud, and she was once more deadly pale. Oliver, who watched the old lady anxiously, observed that she was alarmed by these appearances, and so in truth was he. But seeing that she affected to make light of them, he endeavored to do the same, and they so far succeeded that when Rose was persuaded by her aunt to retire for the night, she was in better spirits, and appeared even in better health, and assured them that she felt certain she would wake in the morning quite well. "I hope, ma'am," said Oliver when Mrs. Maylie returned, "that nothing serious is the matter. Miss Maylie doesn't look well tonight, but—" The old lady motioned him not to speak, and sitting herself down in a dark corner of the room, remained silent for some time. At length she said in a trembling voice, "I hope not, Oliver. I've been very happy with her for some years. Too happy, perhaps, and it may be time that I should meet with some misfortune, but I hope it is not this." "What misfortune, ma'am?" inquired Oliver. "The heavy blow," said the old lady, almost inarticulately, "of losing the dear girl who has so long been my comfort and happiness." "God forbid!" exclaimed Oliver hastily. "Amen to that, my child," said the old lady, wringing her hands. "Surely there's no danger of anything so dreadful," said Oliver. 2 hours ago she was quite well." "She is very ill now," rejoined Mrs. Maylie, "and will be worse, I'm sure. My dear, dear Rose. Oh, what should I do without her?" The lady sank beneath her desponding thoughts and gave way to such great grief that Oliver, suppressing his own emotion, ventured to remonstrate with her, to beg earnestly that for the sake of the dear young lady herself she would be more calm. "And consider, ma'am," said Oliver, as the tears forced themselves into his eyes, despite his efforts to the contrary, "consider now how young and good she is, and what pleasure and comfort she gives to all about her. I'm sure, certain, quite certain, that for your sake, who are so good yourself, and for her own, and for the sake of all she makes so happy, she will not die. God will never let her die yet." "Hush," said Mrs. Maylie, laying her hand on Oliver's head. "You think like a child, poor boy, and although what you say may be natural, it is wrong. But you teach me my duty notwithstanding. I had forgotten it for a moment, Oliver, and I hope I may be pardoned, for I'm old, and have seen enough of illness and death to know the pain they leave to those behind. I've seen enough, too, to know that it is not always the youngest and best who are spared to those that love them, but that this should give us comfort rather than sorrow, for heaven is just, and such things teach us impressively that there is a far brighter world than this, and that the passage to it is speedy. God's will be done, but I love her, and He alone knows how well." Oliver was surprised to see that as Mrs. Maylie said these words, she checked her lamentations as though by one struggle, and drawing herself up as she spoke, became quite composed and firm. He was still more astonished to find that this firmness lasted, that under the all care and watching which ensued, Mrs. Maylie was ever ready and collected, performing all the duties which devolved upon her steadily, and to all external experience, quote, appearance, even cheerfully. But he was young, and did not know what strong minds are capable of under trying circumstances. How should he indeed, when their possessors so seldom know themselves? An anxious night ensued, and when morning came, Mrs. Maylight's predictions were but too well verified. Rose was in the first stage of a high and dangerous fever. "We must be active, Oliver, and not give way to useless grief," said Mrs. Maylight, laying her finger on her lip as she looked steadily into his face. "This letter must be sent with all possible expedition to Mr. Losberne. It must be carried to the market town, which is not more than 4 miles off by the footpath across the fields, and thence dispatched by an express on horseback straight to Chertsey. The people at the inn will undertake to do this, and I can trust you to see it done, I know." Oliver could make no reply, but looked his anxiety to be gone at once. "Here is another letter," said Mrs. Maylight, pausing to reflect. "But whether to send it now, or wait until I see how Rose goes on, I scarcely know. I would not forward it unless I feared the worst." "Is it for Chertsey, too, ma'am?" inquired Oliver, impatient to execute his commission, and holding out his trembling hand for the letter. "No," replied the old lady, giving it him mechanically. Oliver glanced at it, and saw that it was directed to Harry Maylie, Esquire, at some lord's house in the country, where he could not make out. "Shall it go, ma'am?" asked Oliver, looking up impatiently. "I think not," replied Mrs. Maylight, taking it back. "I will wait till tomorrow." With these words she gave Oliver her purse, and he started off without more delay at the greatest speed he could muster. Swiftly he ran across the fields and down the little lanes which sometimes divided them, now almost hidden by the high corn on either side, and now emerging into an open field where the mowers and haymakers were busy at their work. Nor did he stop once, save now and then for a few seconds to recover breath, until he emerged in a great heat and covered with dust on the little marketplace of the market town. Here he paused and looked about for the inn. There was a white bank, and a red brewery, and a yellow town hall, and in one corner a large house with all the wood about it painted green, before which was the sign of "The George," to which he hastened directly it caught his eye. Oliver spoke to a postboy who was dozing under the gateway, and who, after hearing what he wanted, referred him to the hostler, who, after hearing all he had to say again, referred him to the landlord, who was a tall gentleman in a blue neckcloth, a white hat, drab breeches, and boots with tops to match, and was leaning against a pump by the stable door, picking his teeth with a silver toothpick. The next couple paragraphs are nerve-wracking. What if Oliver screwed up again? This gentleman walked with much deliberation to the bar to make out the bill, which took a long time making out, and after it was ready and paid, a horse had to be saddled, and a man to be dressed, which took up 10 good minutes more. Meanwhile, Oliver was in such a desperate state of impatience and anxiety that he felt as if he could have jumped upon the horse himself and galloped away full tear to the next stage. At length all was ready, and the little parcel having been handed up, with many injunctions and entreaties for its speedy delivery, the man set spurs to his horse, and, rattling over the uneven paving of the market-place, was out of the town, and galloping along the turnpike road in a couple of minutes. It was something to feel certain that assistance was sent for, and that no time had been lost. Oliver hurried up the inn yard with a somewhat lighter heart, which he did not appreciate at all. He's growing up, and was turning out of the gateway, when he accidentally stumbled against a tall man, wrapped in a cloak, who was that moment coming out of the inn door. What was I thinking? "Ha!" cried the man, fixing his eyes on Oliver, and suddenly recoiling. "What the devil's this?" "I beg your pardon, sir," said Oliver. "I was in a great hurry to get home and didn't see you were coming." "Death!" muttered the man to himself, glaring at the boy with his large, dark eyes. "Who'd have thought it? Grind him to ashes! He'd start up from a marble coffin to come in my way." "I'm sorry, sir," stammered Oliver, confused by the strange man's wild look. "I hope I have not hurt you?" "Rot his bones!" murmured the man in a horrible passion between his clenched teeth. "If I only had the courage to say the word, I might have been free of him in a night. Curses light upon your head, black death upon your heart, you imp! What are you doing here?" The man shook his fist and gnashed his teeth as he uttered these words incoherently, and advancing towards Oliver, as if with the intention of aiming a blow at him, fell violently on the ground, writhing and foaming in a fit. Oliver gazed for a moment at the fearful struggles of the madman, for such he supposed him to be, and then darted into the house for help. Having seen him safely carried into the hotel, he turned his face homewards, running as fast as he could to make up for lost time, and recalling, with a great deal of astonishment and some fear, the extraordinary behavior of the person for whom he had just parted. The circumstance did not dwell in his recollection long, however, for when he reached the cottage there was enough to occupy his mind, and to drive all considerations of self completely from his memory. Rose Maylie had rapidly grown worse, and before midnight was delirious. A medical practitioner who resided on the spot was in constant attendance upon her. She was not wetting the bed, and after first seeing the patient, he had taken Mrs. Maylie aside, and pronounced her disorder to be one of a most alarming nature. In fact, he said, it'd be little short of a miracle if she recovered. How often did Oliver start from his bed that night, and stealing out with noiseless footsteps to the staircase, listen for the slightest sound from the sick chamber. How often did a tremble shake his frame, and cold drops of terror start upon his brow, when a sudden trampling of feet caused him to fear that something too dreadful to think of it had even occurred. And what had been the fervency of all the prayers he had ever uttered, compared with those he poured forth now, in the agony and passion of his supplication for the life and health of the gentle creature who was tottering on the deep grave's verge. The suspense, the fearful, acute suspense of standing idly by while the life of one we dearly love is trembling in the balance, the racking thoughts that crowd upon the mind and make the heart beat violently, and the breath come thick by the force of the images they conjure up before it, the desperate anxiety to be doing something, to relieve the pain or lessen the danger which we have no power to illustrate, alleviate, and the sinking of soul and spirit which the sad remembrance of our helplessness produces. What tortures can equal these, and what reflections or efforts can, in the full tide and fever of the time, allay them? Morning came, and the little cottage, was lonely and still. People spoke in whispers, anxious faces appeared at the gate from time to time, and women and children went away in tears. All the livelong day and for hours after it had grown dark, Oliver paced softly up and down the garden, raising his eyes every instant to the sick chamber, and shuddering to see the darkened window looking as if death lay stretched inside. Late at night, Mr. Losberne arrived. "It is hard," said the good doctor, turning away as he spoke. "So young, so much loved, but there is very little hope." Another morning the sun shone brightly as if it looked upon no misery or care. And with every leaf and flower in full bloom about her, with life and health and sounds and sights of joy surrounding her on every side, the fair young creature lay wasting fast. Oliver crept away to the old churchyard, and sitting down on one of the green mounds, wept for her in silence. There was such peace and beauty in the scene, so much brightness and mirth in the sunny landscape, such blithesome music in the songs of the summer birds, such freedom in the rapid flight of the rook careering overhead, so much of life and joyousness in all, that when the boy raised his aching eyes and looked about, the thought instinctively occurred to him that this was not a time for death, that Rose could surely never die when humbler things were also glad and gay, that graves were for cold and cheerless winter, not for sunlight and fragrance. He almost thought that shrouds were for the old and shrunken, and never wrapped the young and graceful form within their ghastly folds. A knell from the church bell broke harshly on these youthful thoughts. Another, again. It was the toiling for the funeral service. A group of humble mourners entered the gate, and they wore white favors, for the corpse was young. They stood uncovered by a grave, and there was a mother once, among the weeping train. But the sun shone brightly, and the birds sang on. Oliver turned homewards, thinking on the many kindnesses he had received from the young lady, and wishing that the time could come over again, that he might never cease showing her how grateful and attached he was. He had no cause for self-reproach on the score of neglect or want of thought, for he had been devoted to her service, and yet 100 little occasions rose up before him on which he fancied he might have been more zealous and more earnest, and wished he had been. We need be careful how we deal with those about us, for every death carries with it to some small circle of survivors thoughts of so much omitted, and so little done, of so many things forgotten, and so many more which might have been repaired, that such recollections are among the bitterest we can have. There is no remorse so deep as that which is unavailing. If we would be spared its tortures, let us remember this in time. When he reached home, Mrs. Maylai was sitting in the little parlor. Oliver's heart sank at sight of her, for she had never left the bedside of her niece, and he trembled to think what change could have driven her away. He learnt that she had fallen into a deep sleep, from which she would awaken again, either to recovery and life, or to bid them farewell and die. They sat, listening and afraid to speak, for hours. The untasted meal was removed, and with looks which showed that their thoughts were elsewhere, they watched the sun as he sank lower and lower, and at length cast over sky and earth those brilliant hues which herald his departure. Their quick ears caught the sound of an approaching footstep, and they both involuntarily darted towards the door as Mr. Losberne entered. "What of Rose?" cried the old lady. "Tell me at once. I can bear it. Anything but suspense. Oh, tell me, in the name of heaven!" "You must compose yourself," said the doctor, supporting her. "Be calm, my dear man, pray." "Let me go, in God's name," gasped Mrs. Maylie. "My dear child, she's dead, she's dying." "No," cried the doctor passionately. "As he is good and merciful, she will live to bless us all for years to come." The lady fell upon her knees and tried to fold her hands together, but the energy which had supported her so long fled to heaven with her first thanksgiving, and she sunk back into the friendly arms which were extended to receive her. Book the First, Chapter the 9th. It was late next morning when Oliver awoke from a sound, long sleep. There was nobody in the room beside, but Mr. Fagin, who was boiling some coffee in a saucepan for breakfast, and whistling softly to himself as he stirred it round and round with an iron spoon. He would stop every now and then to listen when there was the least noise below, and when he had satisfied himself, he would go on whistling and stirring again as before. Although Oliver had roused himself from sleep, he was not thoroughly awake. There is a drowsy, heavy state between sleeping and waking, when you dream more than 5 minutes with your eyes half open, and yourself half conscious of everything that's passing around you, than you would in 5 nights with your eyes fast closed, and your senses wrapped in perfect unconsciousness. At such times, a mortal knows just enough of what his mind is doing to form some glimmering conception of its mighty powers, its bounding from earth and spurning time and space, when freed from the irksome restraint of its corporeal associate. Oliver was precisely in this condition I have described. He saw Mr. Fagin with his half-closed eyes, heard his low whistling, and recognized the sound of the spoon grating against the saucepan's sides, and yet the self-same senses were mentally engaged at the same time in busy action with almost everybody he had ever known. When the coffee was done, Mr. Fagin drew the saucepan to the hob, and standing in an irresolute attitude for a few minutes, as if he did not well know how to employ himself, turned round and looked at Oliver, and called him by his name. He did not answer, and was to all appearance asleep. After satisfying himself upon this head, Mr. Fagin stepped gently to the door, which he fastened. He then drew forth, as it seemed to Oliver, from some trap in the floor, a small box, which he placed carefully on the table. His eyes glistened as he raised the lid and looked in. Dragging an old chair to the table, he sat down, and took from its magnificent gold watch a magnificent gold watch, sparkling with diamonds. "Aha!" said Mr. Fagin, shrugging up his shoulders and distorting every feature with a hideous grin. Clever dogs, staunch to the last. Never told the old parson where they were, never peached upon old Fagin. And why should they? It wouldn't have loosened the knot, or kept the drop up a minute longer. No. Fine fellows. With these and other muttered reflections of the like nature, Mr. Fagin once more deposited the watch in its place of safety. At least half a dozen more were severally drawn forth from the same box, and surveyed with equal pleasure. Besides rings, brooches, bracelets, and other articles of jewelry, of such magnificent materials and costly workmanship that Oliver had no idea even of their names. Having replaced these trinkets, Mr. Fagin took out another, so small that it lay in the palm of his hand. There seemed to be some very minute inscription on it, for Mr. Fagin laid it flat upon the table, and shading it with his hand, pored over it long and earnestly. At length he set it down as if despairing of success, and leaning back in his chair muttered, "What a fine thing capital punishment is! Dead men never repent. Dead men never bring awkward stories to light. The prospect of the gallows, too, makes them hardy and bold. It's a fine thing for the trade. 5 of them strung up in a row, none left to play booty or turn white-livered." As Mr. Fagin uttered these words, his bright dark eyes, which had been staring vacantly before him, fell on Oliver's face. The boy's eyes were fixed on his in mute curiosity. And although the recognition was only for an instant, for the briefest space of time that can possibly be conceived, it was enough to show the old man that he had been observed. He closed the lid of the box with a loud crash, and laying his hand on a bread knife, which was on the table, started furiously up. He trembled very much, though, for even in his terror, Oliver could see that the knife quivered in the air. "What's that?" said Mr. Fagin. "What do you watch me for? Why are you awake? What have you seen? Speak out, boy. Quick, quick, for your life." "I wasn't able to sleep any longer, sir," replied Oliver meekly. "I'm very sorry if I've disturbed you, sir." "You were not awake an hour ago?" said Mr. Fagin, scowling fiercely on the boy. "No, no, indeed, sir," replied Oliver. "Are you sure?" cried Mr. Fagin. With a still fiercer look than before and a threatening attitude. "Upon my word, I was not, sir," replied Oliver earnestly. "I was not, indeed, sir." "Tush, tush, my dear," said Mr. Fagin, suddenly resuming his old manner and playing with the knife a little before he laid it down, as if to induce the belief that he had caught it up in mere sport. "Of course I know that, my dear. I only tried to frighten you. You're a brave boy." "Ha ha! You're a brave boy, Oliver," said Mr. Fagin. And Mr. Fagin rubbed his hands with a chuckle, but looked uneasily at the box notwithstanding. "Did you see any of these pretty things, my dear?" said Mr. Fagin, laying his hand upon it after a short pause. "Yes, sir," replied Oliver. "Ah," said Mr. Fagin, turning rather pale. They're mine, Oliver, my little property. All I have to live upon in my old age. The folks call me a miser, my dear. Only a miser, that's all." Oliver thought the old gentleman must be a deciding miser to live in such a dirty place with so many watches, but thinking that perhaps his fondness for the Dodger and the other boys cost him a good deal of money, he only cast a deferential look at the negative and asked if he might get up. "Certainly, my dear, certainly," replied the old gentleman. "Stay, there's a pitcher of water in the corner by the door. Bring it here, and I'll give you a basin to wash in, my dear." Oliver got up, walked across the room, and stooped for one instant to raise the pitcher. When he turned his head, the box was gone. He had scarcely washed himself, and made everything tidy by emptying the basin out of the window, agreeable to the Jew's directions. Then the Dodger returned, accompanied by a very sprightly young friend whom Oliver had seen smoking on the previous night. Great care. A quote from the chapter 9 or 10 of book 2. And who was now formally introduced to him as Charlie Bates. The four then sat down to breakfast off the coffee and some hot rolls and ham which the Dodger had brought home in the crown of his hat. Well, said the negative, glancing slyly at Oliver and addressing himself to the Dodger, I hope you've been at work this morning, my dears. Hard, replied the Dodger. As nails, added Charlie Bates. Good boys, said the negative. What have you got, Dodger? A couple of pocketbooks, replied that young gentleman. Lined? Inquired the negative, with trembling eagerness. Pretty well, replied the Dodger, producing 2 pocketbooks, one green and the other red. Not so heavy as they might be, said the negative, after looking at the insides carefully, but very neat and nicely made. Ingenious workman, ain't he, Oliver? Very indeed, sir, said Oliver, at which Mr. Charlie Bates laughed uproariously, very much to the amazement of Oliver, who saw nothing to laugh at in anything that had passed. And what have you got, my dear? Said Fagin to Charlie Bates. Wipes, replied Master Bates, at the same time producing 4 pocket handkerchiefs. Well, said the negative, inspecting them closely. They're very good ones, very. You haven't marked them well, though, Charlie, so the marks should be picked out with a needle. And we'll teach Oliver how to do it. Shall us, Oliver, eh? If you please, sir, said Oliver. You'd like to be able to make pocket handkerchiefs as easy as Charlie Bates, wouldn't you, my dear? Said the negative. Very much indeed, if you'll teach me, sir, replied Oliver. Master Bates saw something so exquisitely ludicrous in this reply that he burst into another laugh, which laugh, meeting the coffee he was drinking and carrying it down some wrong channel, very nearly terminated in his premature suffocation. He is so jolly green, said Charlie when he recovered, as an apology to the company for his unpolite behavior. The Dodger said nothing, but he smoothed Oliver's hair down over his eyes, and said he'd know better by and by, upon which... Man, that guy creeps me out. Upon which the old gentleman, observing Oliver's color mounting, changed the subject by asking whether there had been much of a crowd at the execution that morning. This made him wonder more and more, for it was plain from the replies of the 2 boys that they had been there before, and Oliver naturally wondered how they could possibly have found town to be so very industrious. When the breakfast was cleared away, the merry old gentleman and the 2 boys played at a very curious and uncommon game, which was performed in this way. The merry old gentleman, placing a snuff-box in one pocket of his trousers, a note-case in the other, and a watch in his waistcoat pocket, with a guard chain round his neck, and sticking a mock diamond pin in his shirt, buttoned his coat tight round him, and putting his spectacle case and handkerchief in the pockets, trotted up and down the room with a stick, in imitation of the manner in which old gentlemen walk about the streets every hour in the day. Sometimes he stopped at the fireplace, sometimes at the door, making belief that he was staring with all his might into shop windows. At such times he would look constantly round him for fear of thieves, and keep slapping all his pockets in turn to see that he hadn't lost anything, in such a very funny and natural manner that Oliver laughed till the tears ran down his face. All this time, the two boys followed him closely about, getting out of his sight so nimbly every time he turned round that it was impossible to follow their motions. At last, the Dodger trod upon his toes, or ran upon his boot accidentally, while Charlie Bates stumbled up against him behind, and in that one moment they took from him, with the most extraordinary rapidity, snuff-box, note-case, watch-guard, chain, shirt-pin, pocket-handkerchief, even the spectacle-case. If the old gentleman felt a hand in any one of his pockets, he cried out where it was, and then the game began all over again. When this game had been played a great many times, a couple of young ladies came to see the young gentleman, one of whom was called Bet, and the other Nancy. They wore a good deal of hair, not very neatly turned up behind, and were rather untidy about the shoes and stockings. They were not exactly pretty, perhaps, but they had a great deal of color in their faces and looked quite stout and hearty. Being remarkably free and agreeable in their manners, Oliver thought them very nice girls indeed, as there is no doubt they were. These visitors stopped a long time. Spirits were produced, in consequence of one of the young ladies complaining of a coldness in her inside, and a lack of justice in the outside, and the conversation took a very convivial and improving turn. At length Charlie Bates expressed his opinion that it was time to pad the hoof, which it occurred to Oliver must be French for going out. For directly afterwards the Dodger and Charlie and the two young ladies went away together, having been kindly furnished with money to spend by the amiable old Negative. "There, my dear," said Fagin. "That's a pleasant life, isn't it? They've gone out for the day." "Have they done work, sir?" inquired Oliver. "Yes," said the Negative. "That is, unless they should unexpectedly come across any when they are out. And they won't neglect it if they do, my dear, depend upon it." "Make 'em your models, my dear, make 'em your models," said the Negative, topping the fire shovel on the hearth to add force to his words. "Do everything they bid you, and take their advice in all matters, especially the Dodger's, my dear. He'll be a great man himself, and make you one too if you take pattern by him. Is my handkerchief hanging out of my pocket, my dear?" said the Negative, stopping short. "Yes, sir," said Oliver. "See if you can take it out without my feeling it, as you saw them do when we were at play this morning." Oliver held up the bottom of the pocket with one hand, as he had seen the Dodger do, and drew the handkerchief lightly out of it with the other. "Is it gone?" cried the wife. "Here it is, sir," said Oliver, showing it in his hand. "You're a clever boy, my dear," said the playful old gentleman, patting Oliver on the head approvingly. "I never saw a sharper lad. Here's a shilling for you. If you go on in this way, you'll be the greatest man of the time. And now come here, and I'll show you how to take the marks out of the handkerchiefs." Oliver wondered what picking the old gentleman's pockets in play had to do with his chances of being a great man. But thinking that the road like in Don Quixote, I think, being so much his senior, must know best, followed him quietly to the table, and was soon deeply involved in his new study. Book the 1st, chapter the 10th. For 8 or 10 days, Oliver remained in Mr. Fagin's room, picking the marks out of the pocket handkerchiefs, of which a great number were brought home, and sometimes taking part in the game already described, which the 2 boys and Mr. Fagin played regularly every day. At length he began to languish for the fresh air, and took many occasions of earnestly entreating the old gentleman to allow him to go out to work with his 2 companions. Oliver becomes better acquainted with the characters of his new associates, and purchases experience at a high price, being a short but very important chapter in this history, Stephen. So keep reading. Oliver was rendered the more anxious to be actively employed by what he had seen of the stern morality of the old gentleman's character. Whenever the Dodger or Charlie Bates came home at night empty-handed, he would expatiate with great vehemence on the misery of idle and lazy habits, and enforce upon them the necessity of an active life by sending them, supperless, to bed. Upon one occasion, he even went so far as to knock them both down a flight of stairs, as opposed to up a flight of stairs. But this was carrying out his virtuous precepts to an unusual extent. At length one morning, Oliver obtained the permission he had so eagerly sought. There had been no handkerchiefs to work upon for 2 or 3 days, and the dinners had been rather meagre. Perhaps these were reasons for the old gentleman's giving his assent. But whether they were or no, he told Oliver he might go, and placed him under the joint guardianship of Charlie Bates and his friend the Dodger. All of a sudden I feel like a real know-it-all, and I feel terrible. The 3 boys sallied out, the Dodger with his coat sleeves tucked up and his hat cocked as usual. Yeah, but he's a pimp. Master Bates sauntering along with his hands in his pockets. I like him. And Noah Claypole. No. Oliver. Oliver between them, wondering where they were going, and what branch of manufacture he would be instructed in first. The pace at which they went was such a very lazy, ill-looking saunter, that Oliver soon began to think his companions were going to deceive the old gentleman by not going to work at all. The Dodger had a vicious propensity, too, of pulling the caps from the heads of small boys and tossing them down areas, while Charlie Bates exhibited some very loose notions concerning the rights of property, by pilfering divers apples and onions from the stalls at the kennel sides, and thrusting them into pockets which were so surprisingly capacious that they seemed to undermine his whole suit of clothes in every direction. These things looked so bad that Oliver was on the point of declaring his intention of seeking his way back in the best way he could, when his thoughts were suddenly directed into another channel by a very mysterious change of behavior on the part of the Dodger. They were just emerging from a narrow court, not far from the open square in Clerkenwell, which is called, by some strange perversion of terms, the Green, when the Dodger made a sudden stop, and laying his finger on his lip, drew his companions back again with the greatest caution and circumspection. "What's the matter?" demanded Oliver. "Hush," replied the Dodger. "Do you see that old cove at the bookstall?" "The old gentleman over the way?" said Oliver. "Yes, I see him." "He'll do," said the Dodger. "A prime plant," observed Charlie Bates. Oliver looked from one to the other with the greatest surprise, but was not permitted to make any inquiries, for the 2 boys walked stealthily across the road and slunk close behind the old gentleman towards whom his attention had been directed. Oliver walked a few paces after them, and, not knowing whether to advance or retire, stood looking on in silent amazement. The old gentleman was a very respectable-looking personage, with a powdered head and gold spectacles, dressed in a bottle-green coat with a black velvet collar and white trousers, with a smart bamboo cane under his arm. He had taken up a book from the stall, and there he stood, reading away as hard as if he were in his elbow chair in his own study. It was very possible that he fancied himself there indeed, for it was plain, from his utter abstraction, that he saw not the bookstall, nor the street, nor the boys, nor, in short, anything but the book itself, which he was reading straight through, turning over the leaves when he got to the bottom of a page, beginning at the top line of the next one, and going regularly on with the greatest interest and eagerness. What was Oliver's horror and alarm, as he stood a few paces off, looking on with his eyelids as wide open as they would possibly go, to see the Dodger plunge his hand into this old gentleman's pocket and draw from thence a handkerchief, which he handed to Charlie Bates, and with which they both ran away round the corner at full speed. In one instant, the whole mystery of the handkerchiefs and the watches and the jewels and the negative rushed upon the boy's mind. He stood for a moment with the blood tingling so through his veins from terror that he felt as if he were in a burning fire. Then, confused and frightened, he took to his heels, and not knowing what he did, made off as fast as he could lay his feet to the ground. This was all done in a minute's space, and the very instant that Oliver began to run, the old gentleman, putting his hand to his pocket, and missing his handkerchief, turned sharp round. Seeing the boy scudding away at such a rapid pace, he very naturally concluded him to be the depredator, and shouting, "Stop, thief!" with all his might, made off after him, book in hand. But the old gentleman was not the only person who raised the hue and cry. The Dodger and Master Bates, unwilling to attract public attention by running down the open street, had merely retired into the very first doorway round the corner. They no sooner heard the cry and saw Oliver running than, guessing exactly how the matter stood, they issued forth with great promptitude, and shouting, "Stop, thief!" too joined in the pursuit like good citizens. Although Oliver had been brought up by philosophers, he was not theoretically acquainted with their beautiful axiom that self-preservation is the first law of nature. If he had been, perhaps he would have been prepared for this. Not being prepared, however, it alarmed him the more. So away he went like the wind, like the old gentleman and the two boys roaring and shouting behind him. "Stop, thief! Stop, thief!" There is a magic in the sound. The tradesman leaves his counter, and the carman his wagon. The butcher throws down his tray, the baker his basket. Wow, I'm really reading this out loud. The milkman his pail, the errand boy his parcels, the schoolboy his marbles, the pavior his pickaxe, the child his battledore. Away they run, pell-mell, helter-skelter, slapdash, tearing, yelling, and screaming, knocking down the passengers as they turn the corners, rousing up the dogs, and astonishing the fowls. And streets, squares, and courts re-echo with the sound. "Stop, thief! Stop, thief!" The cry is taken up by 100 voices, and the crowd accumulate at every turning. Away they fly, splashing through the mud, and rattling along the pavements. Up go the windows, outrun the people, onward bear the mob. A whole audience desert punch in the very thickest of the plot, and joining the rushing throng, swell the shout and lend fresh vigor to the cry, "Stop thief! Stop thief! Stop thief! Stop thief!" There is a passion for neglecting deeply implanted in the human breast. One wretched, breathless child, panting with exhaustion, terror in his looks, agony in his eye, large drops of perspiration streaming down his face, strains every nerve to make head upon his pursuers. And as they follow on his track, Article 4 of the Constitution of the United States of America, and gain upon him every instant, they hail his decreasing strength with still louder shouts, and whoop and scream with joy, "Stop, thief!" Aye, stop him, for God's sake, were it only in mercy. Stopped at last. A clever blow that. He's down upon the pavement, and the crowd eagerly gather round him, each newcomer jostling and struggling with the others to catch a glimpse. "Stand aside. Give him a little air." "Nonsense, he don't deserve it." "Where's the gentleman?" "Here he is, coming down the street." "Make room for the gentleman." "Is this the boy, sir?" "Yes." Oliver lay covered with mud and dust, and bleeding from the mouth, looking wildly round upon the few people, heap of faces that surrounded him, when the old gentleman was officiously dragged and pushed into the circle by the foremost of the pursuers, and made this reply to their anxious inquiries. "Yes," said the gentleman in a benevolent voice, "I'm afraid it is." "Afraid?" murmured the crowd. "That's a good un." "Poor fellow," said the gentleman. "He has hurt himself." "I did that, sir," said a great lubberly fellow stepping forward, "and preciously I cut my knuckle against his mouth." "I stopped him, sir." The fellow touched his hat with a grin, expecting something for his pains, but the old gentleman, eyeing him with an expression of disgust, looked anxiously round, as if he contemplated running away himself, which it is very possible he might have attempted to do, and thus afforded another chase, had not a police officer, who is always the last person to arrive in such cases, at that moment made his way through the crowd, and seized Oliver by the collar. "Come, get up," said the man roughly. "It wasn't me, indeed, sir, indeed, it was two other boys," said Oliver, clasping his hands passionately, and looking round. "They're here, somewhere." "Oh, no, they ain't," said the officer. He meant this to be ironical, but it was true besides, for the Dodger and Charlie Bates had filed off down the first convenient court they came to, together and alone. It's weird. "Come, get up." "Don't hurt him," said the old gentleman compassionately. "Oh, no, I won't hurt him," replied the officer, tearing his jacket halfway off his back in proof thereof. "Come, I know you, it won't do. Will you stand upon your legs, you young devil?" Oliver, who could hardly stand, made a shift to raise himself upon his feet, and was lugged along the streets by the jacket collar at a rapid pace. The gentleman walked on with them by the officer's side, and as many of the crowd as could got a little ahead and stared back at Oliver from time to time. The boys shouted in triumph, and on they went. Very streams, bloody brow, Jupiter. Chapter the 22nd, The Burglary. "Hello," cried a loud, hoarse voice directly they had set foot in the passage. "Don't make such a row," said Sikes. "Aha, my pal," cried the same voice. "A glim, Barney, a glim. Show the gentleman in, Barney, and wake up first, if convenient." The speaker appeared to throw a boot-jack or some other article at the person he addressed to rouse him from his slumbers, for the noise of a wooden body falling violently was heard, and then an indistinct muttering as of a man between asleep and awake. "Connecticut. Do you hear?" cried the same voice. "There's Bill Sikes in the passage with nobody to do the civil to him, and you sleeping there as if you took laudanum with your meals, and nothing stronger. Are you any fresher now, or do you want the iron candlestick to wake you thoroughly?" A pair of slipshod feet shuffled hastily across the bare floor of the room as this interrogatory was put, and there issued from a door on the right hand, first a feeble candle, and next the form of the same individual who has been heretofore described as laboring under the infirmity of speaking through his nose, and officiating as waiter at the public house on Saffron Hill. "The thief!" exclaimed Barney, with real or counterfeit joy. "Come in, sir, come in." "Here, you get on first," said Sikes, putting Oliver in front of him. "Quicker, or I shall tread upon your heels." Muttering a curse upon his tardiness, Sikes pushed Oliver before him, and they entered a low, dark room with a smoky fire, 2 or 3 broken chairs, a table, and a very old couch, on which, with his legs much higher than his head, a man was reposing at full length, smoking a long clay pipe. He was dressed in a smartly cut, snuff-colored coat, with large brass buttons, an orange neckerchief, a coarse staring shawl-patterned waistcoat, and drab breeches. Mr. Crackit, for he it was, had no very great quantity of hair either upon his head or face, but what he had was of a reddish dye and tortured into long corkscrew curls through which he occasionally thrust some very dirty fingers, ornamented with large common rings. He was a trifle above the middle size, and apparently rather weak in the legs, but this circumstance by no means detracted from his own admiration of his top boots, which he contemplated in their elevated situation with lively satisfaction. "Bill, my boy," said this figure, turning his head towards the door, "I'm glad to see you. I was almost afraid you'd given it up, in which case I should have made a personal venture. Hello!" Uttering this exclamation in a tone of great surprise, as his eyes rested on Oliver, Mr. Toby Crackit brought himself into a sitting posture. Mr. Toby Crackit brought himself into a sitting posture and demanded who that was. "The boy, only the boy," replied Sikes, drawing a chair towards the fire. "What of Mr. Fagin?" exclaimed Barney with a grin. "Fagins, eh?" exclaimed Toby, looking at Oliver. "What an invaluable boy that'll make for the old lady's pockets in chapels. His mug is a fortune to him." There's enough of that," interposed Sikes impatiently, and stooping over his recumbent friend, he whispered a few words in his ear, at which Mr. Crackit laughed immensely. 4th time's the charm. And honored Oliver with a long stare of astonishment. "Now," said Sikes as he resumed his seat, "if you'll give us something to eat and drink while we're waiting, you'll put some heart in us, or in me at all events. Sit down by the fire, younker, and rest yourself, for you'll have to go out with us again tonight. though not very far off. Oliver looked at Sykes in mute and timid wonder, and drawing a stool to the fire, sat with his aching head upon his hands, scarcely knowing where he was or what was passing around him. "Here," said Toby, as the young man placed some fragments of food and a bottle upon the table. "Success to the crack." He rose to honor the toast, and carefully depositing his empty pipe in a corner, advanced to the table, filled a glass with spirits, and drank off its contents. Mr. Sykes did the same. "A drain for the boy," said Toby, half filling a wine-glass. "Down with it, innocence." "Indeed," said Oliver, looking piteously up into the man's face. "Indeed, "Down with it," echoed Toby. "Do you think I don't know what's good for you? Tell him to drink it, Bill." "He had better," said Sykes, clasping his hand upon his pocket. "Burn my body, if he isn't more trouble than a whole family of dodgers. Drink it, you perverse imp! Drink it!" Frightened by the menacing gesture of the two men, Oliver hastily swallowed. They slept, or appeared to sleep, for some time, nobody stirring but Barney, who rose once or twice to throw coals upon the fire. Oliver fell into a heavy doze, imagining himself straying alone through the gloomy lanes, or wandering about the dark churchyard, or retracing some one or other of the scenes of the past day, when he was roused by Toby Crackett's jumping up and declaring it was 1:30. In an instant the other two were on their legs, and all were actively in engaged preparation. Sykes and his companion enveloped their chins and necks in large dark shawls, and drew on their greatcoats, while Barney, opening a cupboard, brought forth several articles, which he hastily crammed into his pockets. "Barkers for me, Barney?" said Toby Crackett. "Here they are," replied Barney, producing a pair of pistols. "You loaded them yourself." "All right," replied Toby, stowing them away. "The persuaders?" "I've got 'em," replied Sykes. "Crepe, keys, centerbit, darkies, nothing forgotten?" inquired Toby, fastening a small crowbar to a loop inside the skirt of his coat. "All right," rejoined his companion. "Bring them bits of timber, Barney. That's the time of day." With these words he took a thick stick from Barney's hands, who, having delivered another to Toby, busied himself in fastening on Oliver's cape. "Now then," said Sykes, holding out his hand. Oliver, who was completely stupefied by the unwonted exercise, and the air, and the drink that had been forced upon him, put his hand mechanically into that which Sykes had extended for the purpose. "Take his other hand, Toby," said Sykes. "Look out, Barney." The man went to the door, and returned to announce that all was quiet. The two robbers issued forth with Oliver between them, and Barney, having made all fast, rolled himself up as before, and was soon asleep again. It was now intensely dark. The fog was much heavier than it had been in the earlier part of the night. The atmosphere was so damp that, although no rain fell, Oliver's hair and eyebrows, within a few minutes after leaving the house, had become stiff with the half-frozen moisture that was floating about. They crossed the bridge, and kept on towards the lights which he had seen before. They were at no great distance off, and as they walked pretty briskly, they soon arrived at Chertsey. "Slap through the town," whispered Sykes. "There'll be nobody in the way tonight to see us." Toby acquiesced, and they hurried through the main street of the town, which at that late hour was wholly deserted. A dim light shone at intervals from some bedroom window, and the hoarse barking of dogs occasionally broke the silence of the night. But there was nobody abroad, and they had cleared the town as the church bell had struck 2. Quickening their pace, without the past perfect tense, they turned up a road upon the left hand. After walking about a quarter of a mile, they stopped before a detached house surrounded by a wall, to the top of which Toby Crackit, scarcely pausing to take breath, climbed in a twinkling. "The boy next," said Toby. "Hoist him up. I'll catch hold of him." Before Oliver had time to look round, Sikes had caught him under the arms, and in 3 or 4 seconds he and Toby were lying on the grass on the other side. Sikes followed directly, and they stole cautiously towards the house. And now, for the first time, Oliver, well-nigh mad with grief and terror, saw that housebreaking and robbery, if not murder, were the objects of the expedition. He clasped He clapped like a trained monkey. He clasped his hands together and involuntarily uttered a subdued exclamation of horror. A mist came before his eyes. The cold sweat stood upon his ashy face. His limbs failed him, and he sunk upon his knees. "Get up," murmured Sikes, trembling with rage and drawing the pistol from his pocket. "Get up, or I'll strew your brains upon the grass." "Oh, for God's sake, let me go!" cried Oliver. "Let me run away and die in the fields. I'll never come near London. Never, never. Oh, pray have mercy upon me, and do not make me steal. For the love of all the bright angels that rest in heaven, have mercy upon me." The man to whom this appeal was made swore a dreadful oath, and had cocked the pistol, when Toby, striking it from his grasp, placed his hand upon the boy's mouth, and dragged him to the house. "Hush!" cried the man. "It won't answer here. Say another word, and I'll do your business myself with a crack on the head that makes no noise, and is quite as certain and more gentile. Here, Bill, wrench the shutter open. He's game enough now, I'll engage. I've seen older hands of his age took the same way, for a minute or 2, on a cold night." Sikes, invoking terrific imprecations upon Fagin's head for sending Oliver on such an errand, plied the crowbar vigorously, but with little noise, and after some delay and some assistance from Toby, the shutter to which he had referred swung open on its hinges. It was a little lattice window, about 5.5 feet above the ground, at the back of the house, belonging to a scullery or some small brewing place at the end of the passage. The aperture was so small that the inmates had probably not thought it worth while to defend it more securely, but it was large enough to admit a boy, of Oliver's size nevertheless. A very brief exercise of Mr. Sikes' art sufficed to overcome the fastening of the lattice, and it soon stood wide open also. "Now listen, you young limb," whispered Sikes, drawing a dark lantern from his pocket and throwing the glare full on Oliver's face. "I'm a-going to put you through there. Take this light, go softly up the steps straight before you, and along the little hall to the street door. Unfasten it. Let us in." "There's a bolt at the top you won't be able to reach," interposed Toby. "Stand upon one of the hall chairs. There are 3 there, Bill, with a jolly large blue unicorn and a gold pitchfork on him, which is the old lady's arms. "Keep quiet, can't you?" replied Sikes with a savage look. "The room door is open, is it?" "Wide," replied Toby, after peeping in to satisfy himself. "The game of that is that they always leave it open with a catch, so that the dog, who's got a bed in here, may walk up and down the passage when he feels wakeful." Oh, it's so hard to laugh. "Ha ha! Barney ticed him away tonight. So neat." Although Mr. Crackit spoke in a scarcely audible whisper, and laughed without noise, Sikes imperiously commanded him to be silent and to get to work. Toby complied by first producing his lantern and placing it on the ground, and then planting himself firmly with his head against the wall beneath the window and his hands upon his knees so as to make a step of his back. This was no sooner done than Sikes, mounting upon him, put Oliver gently through the window, with his feet first, and without leaving hold of his collar, planted him safely on the floor inside. "Take this lantern," said Sikes, looking into the room. "You see the stairs afore you?" Oliver, more dead than alive, gasped out, "Yes." And Sikes, pointing to the street door with the pistol barrel, briefly advised him to take notice that he was within shot all the way, and that if he faltered, he would fall dead that instant. "It's done in a minute," said Sikes in the same low whisper. "Directly I leave go of you, do your work. Hark!" "What's that?" whispered the other man. They listened intently. "Nothing," said Sikes, releasing his hold of Oliver. "Now." In the short time he had had to collect his senses, the boy had firmly resolved that, whether he died in the attempt or not, he would make one effort to dart upstairs from the hall and alarm the family. Filled with this idea, he advanced at once, but stealthily. "Come back!" suddenly cried Sikes aloud. "Back! Back!" Scared by the sudden breaking of the dead stillness of the place and a loud cry which followed it, Oliver let his lantern fall, and knew not whether to advance or fly. The cry was repeated. A light appeared. A vision of two terrified, half-dressed men at the top of the stairs swam before his eyes. A flash, a loud noise, a smoke, a crash somewhere, but where he knew not, and he staggered back. Sikes had disappeared for an instant, but he was up again, and had him by the collar before the smoke had cleared away. He fired his own pistol after the men who were already retreating, and dragged the boy up. "Clasp your arm tighter," said Sikes as he drew him through the window. "Give me a shawl here. They've hit him. Quick! Damnation, how the boy bleeds!" Then came the loud ringing of a bell, mingled with the noise of firearms and the shouts of men, and the sensation of being carried over uneven ground at a rapid pace. And then the noises grew confused in the distance, and a cold, deadly feeling crept over the boy's heart, and he saw or heard no more. The end of the first book.